Every summer, my dad and I go camping together. It's a tradition he's kept alive since he was a kid, and as I got older, it became something I looked forward to. I'm 16 now, and last year we decided to try a new spot for our annual trip. We found the location online, a remote area in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. The description promised a quiet, secluded campsite and an easy hiking trail. There weren't any pictures to confirm this, but the map seemed straightforward, and we figured the adventure was worth a shot. We set out early on a Friday morning, parking the car along a narrow dirt road and grabbing our gear. The forest was dense, the air heavy with the earthy smell of damp moss and pine. At first, the trail seemed manageable. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor, and birdsong filled the air. But as we went further, the trail became increasingly difficult. Steep sections forced us to scramble over rocks and fallen branches, and parts of the path were so overgrown that we had to push through brambles. After nearly 2 hours, we reached the campsite. To our disappointment, it wasn't what we had imagined. It was nothing more than a small clearing surrounded by trees, with overgrown grass and no unique features. There was no picturesque view or sense of accomplishment, just more woods. Still, we pitched our tents and set up camp, trying to make the best of it. The day passed uneventfully, with my dad sharing stories from his own camping trips. He's a natural storyteller, and I enjoyed listening, even as the sun began to sink lower in the sky. By late afternoon, we decided to gather firewood, wandering just beyond the campsite to collect dry sticks and branches. As we worked, a sudden, sharp yell echoed through the trees. It was distant but unmistakable. A man's voice, rough and raw, carrying a sense of pain or desperation. My dad and I froze, our heads snapping toward the sound. For a moment, everything was silent except for the pounding of my heart. Then it came again, louder this time, closer. We exchanged uneasy glances. My dad's face was tight with concern as he ushered me back toward the campfire. We lit it quickly, its warm glow casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. The yelling continued, sporadic and unsettling, each scream more urgent than the last. I couldn't help but ask my dad if we should help whoever it was. He hesitated, clearly torn. Finally, he made a decision. He told me to stay by the fire, to keep it going, and to not let anyone come near me. He promised he would be careful and would only go far enough to see what was happening. I watched as he disappeared into the trees, his flashlight cutting through the dimness. The screams grew fainter as he moved away, but my anxiety grew stronger. The forest felt alive in a way that it hadn't before, every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig sending a jolt through me. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I tried to keep busy, adding sticks to the fire and scanning the darkness around me. Once, I thought I saw movement between the trees, a shadow too large to be an animal. I held my breath, staring into the void, but nothing emerged. Then, suddenly, the screaming stopped. The silence was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. My thoughts raced. Had my dad found the man? Was he hurt? Or worse? I stood, unable to sit still any longer, and moved toward the edge of the clearing, straining to hear any sound. Finally, faint footsteps reached my ears. Relief washed over me for a moment, but it quickly turned to dread. The steps were deliberate and slow, and they didn't sound like my dad's. They were heavier, almost dragging, as if someone, or something, was making its way toward me. I was frozen in place when, from my left, I heard my dad's voice calling my name. He emerged from the trees at a run, his face pale and tense. He grabbed my arm and urged me back to the campsite, his urgency leaving no room for questions. Back at the fire, he quickly stuffed essentials into his backpack, leaving the tents and other gear behind. His face was etched with fear, a look I'd never seen on him before. Without a word, we began moving, first jogging, then walking as fast as we could back to the car. As we moved along the trail, I noticed my dad glancing over his shoulder repeatedly. His tension was palpable, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. At one point, I thought I heard the same heavy footsteps behind us, But when I looked, the trail was empty. The drive home was silent. My dad's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw set in a rigid line. I wanted to ask what had happened, what he had seen, but the words caught in my throat. His silence said enough. We never talked about that night again. Any time I brought it up, his demeanor shifted, his face going blank as he quickly changed the subject. Whatever he encountered out there, it left a mark on him that hasn't faded. Sometimes, I think about the footsteps I heard in the woods, the ones that were coming toward me before my dad appeared. I wonder what, or who, was out there and what would have happened if he hadn't shown up in time. The forest, once a place of adventure and escape, now feels like a reminder of something darker, something I'll never fully understand. It was a cool autumn weekend when I joined two of my college friends, Ryan and Jamie, for a camping trip in the woods not far from campus. Jamie was the most outdoorsy of the group. Ryan and I were novices when it came to camping, so Jamie took the lead, assuring us he had everything planned. He'd found a secluded spot by the river, surrounded by woods and fields, perfect for a peaceful getaway. The hike to the campsite was longer than I'd expected. It was a couple of miles through uneven terrain, with dense trees on either side. Jamie led us with confidence, his gear neatly strapped to his back, while Ryan and I stumbled over roots and exchanged complaints about the weight of our backpacks. The moment we reached the field, though, all my grumbling faded. The area was stunning, an open expanse bordered by the river on one side and thick woods on the other. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over everything, and the sound of the water was calming. We set up our tents in the middle of the field, a safe distance from the riverbank. Jamie got the fire going, and soon enough, we were sitting around it with beers in hand, talking and laughing as the sun dipped below the horizon. The warm glow of the fire and the crisp night air made it easy to forget the stresses of school. At one point, I glanced toward the tree line and froze. There were figures moving in the shadows. They looked like hunters with dirty clothes and large backpacks, blending into the woods. But something was off. I didn't see any rifles or equipment that hunters typically carried. I pointed them out to Ryan and Jamie. Jamie's face tightened with concern, and he mentioned that hunting in these woods was illegal, especially since it wasn't hunting season. Ryan brushed it off, joking that Jamie was being overly cautious. Still, I couldn't shake the unease creeping over me. The figures disappeared into the trees, and we tried to move on, but the atmosphere felt different after that. Our conversations became quieter, and the sound of the woods, normally alive with crickets and rustling leaves, seemed unnervingly muted. By the time we decided to call it a night, the unease had settled into my chest. We crawled into our tents, but I found it impossible to sleep. The thin walls of the tent did little to shield me from the vast darkness outside. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch. Hours later, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was one of the guys, maybe Jamie heading to the bathroom. But the steps were deliberate and too heavy for just one person. My breath caught as I realized there were multiple sets of footsteps, moving in unison, getting closer. I lay still, my heart pounding, straining to hear. There were no lights, no voices, just the steady crunch of grass underfoot. The footsteps passed so close to my tent I could almost feel their presence. When the sounds grew faint, I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could. Ryan had done the same. We exchanged wide-eyed looks before glancing toward the figures moving away in the distance. They were barely visible, blending into the shadows, but they were there, 5, maybe 6 people, walking together in a line. Jamie was still asleep, so I crept over to his tent and shook him awake. As soon as we explained what had happened, his expression shifted to one of pure alarm. He sat up, his eyes darting to the woods. That's when he saw them again. They weren't walking anymore. They were standing at the edge of the tree line, staring directly at us. Jamie's voice was tense as he told us to hurry. The 3 of us scrambled to pack up our gear, but our movements felt slow, clumsy, like we were stuck in a nightmare. Every time I glanced toward the trees, the figures were still there, unmoving, their silhouettes barely visible against the darkness. We abandoned the fire pit and left most of our things behind, shoving only the essentials into our packs. Then, with adrenaline surging through our veins, we bolted toward the trail. Jamie led the way, his flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. The path was barely visible in the dark, and I stumbled several times, catching myself on tree trunks and rocks. The footsteps behind us started again, this time faster, louder. I didn't dare look back. My only focus was keeping up with Jamie and Ryan, my breath coming in sharp gasps as we pushed through the darkness. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we broke through the trees and onto the dirt road where our car was parked. We piled in, locking the doors and peeling out of there without a second glance. The ride back was silent. Jamie, who was usually the calm and collected one, looked shaken. Ryan and I exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. None of us had an explanation for what we'd just experienced, and the unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Who were those people, and what were they doing out there? Even now, I can't shake the memory of that night. The sight of those figures standing at the edge of the woods, the eerie silence as they passed our tents, it all felt deliberate, like they wanted us to know they were there. Whatever their intentions, one thing is clear: our encounter with them wasn't an accident. Last spring, I decided to take a solo camping trip in the forest just outside of Highland Ridge, the small town where I grew up. Camping has always been my escape. Something about the stillness of nature and the simplicity of it all clears my head. I'm not much for hiking, though. I prefer the laid-back parts of camping, sitting by the fire, reading a book, and enjoying the quiet. Highland Ridge doesn't have much going on. It's a sleepy little town with one main street and a handful of shops, so the nearby forest has become my go-to retreat. The trail I chose this time was one I'd been on countless times. It was a short, easy walk from the parking area to a clearing near the edge of Lockview Lake, a peaceful spot that rarely sees much traffic. When I arrived, I immediately noticed a tent already set up by the water. That was unusual. I'd always had this area to myself. The owner of the tent wasn't hard to spot. He was down by the lake, walking along the sand in what looked like a pair of faded swim trunks and a stained white t-shirt. He seemed to be in his 40s, with a disheveled look that made him stand out. Feeling a little uneasy about not having the place to myself, I walked a bit further along the clearing and found a spot far enough away from him to set up my own tent. As I unpacked my gear and started arranging rocks for the fire pit, I noticed something strange. The man had stopped walking. He was standing by the lake, facing my direction and staring directly at me. It wasn't a casual glance. His body was fully turned toward me, and his gaze didn't waver. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my setup, but the feeling of being watched made my skin crawl. Finally, I decided to wave, hoping it might break the tension. To my relief, he turned and walked away along the shoreline without acknowledging me. I thought that would be the end of it, but the encounter left me on edge. Even after he disappeared into the forest behind his tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I spent the next hour or so sitting by the lake, trying to relax. The water was calm, and the light breeze carried the faint scent of pine and earth. It should have been peaceful, but my eyes kept darting to the woods, half expecting to see him emerge again. When the sun began to set, I moved my chair back to the campsite and started a fire. As the fire crackled and the light around me dimmed, I leaned back in my chair, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw him again. Far beyond the edge of my campsite, near a cluster of trees, a white shape stood out against the shadows. It was him, unmistakably. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I shifted my chair so I was facing him directly, determined to keep him in sight. For what felt like an eternity, he didn't move. The flickering light from my fire made it harder to tell exactly where he was, and as darkness fully set in, he seemed to fade into the shadows. I couldn't see him anymore, but I knew he was there. The hours crawled by, Every so often, I'd hear faint rustling or snapping in the woods, but I couldn't pinpoint the source. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he trying to scare me? Was he waiting for me to fall asleep? At one point, I heard a faint splashing from the direction of the lake. My heart pounded as I strained to see, but there was nothing visible beyond the faint glow of my campfire. I grabbed a stick and fed the fire more wood, its warmth the only thing keeping my anxiety in check. Sleep wasn't an option. I sat there, eyes darting between the tree line and the lake, listening for any sound that could indicate his presence. As the night dragged on, I started questioning my decision to stay. Should I pack up and leave? Would he follow me? Or worse, was he waiting for me to run, knowing I'd have to pass by him in the darkness? Eventually, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The forest transformed in the soft glow, the oppressive shadows retreating. I cautiously scanned the clearing and the tree line. There was no sign of him. His tent was still by the lake, but it looked untouched, as if he hadn't returned to it. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, leaving my fire pit intact but cold. With my bag slung over my shoulder, I started back down the trail toward the parking area. My heart didn't stop racing until I was inside my car, the doors locked, and the engine running. Looking back at the lake as I drove away, I couldn't shake the thought that he might still be there, lurking just out of sight. To this day, I have no idea what his intentions were or why he acted the way he did. I've been camping countless times since then, but I've never gone back to that spot. The memory of that night stays with me, a reminder that solitude in the wild can sometimes come with an unsettling price.